Hello everybody, and welcome to the Maze Madness 1.3 Developers Commentary. I'm Pixel, and you know what? Let's just head straight into this. 1.3 is probably the biggest update so far, apart from the actual release obviously. And whilst there are many minor changes and bug fixes in this version, I'm firstly going to focus on the main parts of the game, that being the single player trial mode. This has actually been something that I've wanted to do for ages now, even before the game hit release 1.0. When testing the game, I always had fun just messing around, seeing how fast I could get through 25 rounds, so I decided to implement that feature properly. This is done through the use of a timer, which is set to measure in-game time and not real-world time. This is because it will help any sort of lag spikes, which are unfortunately very likely due to some technical problems with GameMaker Studio 2 YYC compiler. In short, the timer is done by frames per second, not actual time, which is measured by the computer's clock. Either way, this is how most games are timed in general, and there are no need for external programs to get an accurate time, which is great. I'm thinking of adding demos or ghosts in, properly saved using some sort of JSON file, but that will definitely be for a later update. And it would help in a speedrunning standpoint, and I am currently in the process of getting Maze Madness on speedrun.com. It sounds stupid, but we'll go with it. This single player mode is actually quite simple, as you'd expect. Rather lazily, any power-ups that would have affected the other player, such as the reverse control, swap camera or freeze, are just deleted when the level is generated. I chose this to avoid any confusion in the item setting menu, because this is definitely a minor mode compared to the entire game. I doubt it would be any trouble either way. The camera size is reset to fit the full game window, and voila, the game is now in single player. There's a bit more code to make sure the enemies don't break, but at its core it's the exact same game with just a few extra lines tacked onto the end. The timer that I mentioned earlier is actually used during any game mode now. However, during a multiplayer game it is not shown until the very end. There's a couple of reasons I did this. One being I didn't have enough GUI space to fit it in, especially without it looking clunky and, well, basically a mess. And two, because I didn't want any inexperienced players to be confused on what the actual quote-unquote goal of the game is, which, obviously in a two-player standpoint, is beating the other player to the exit. The next mode I decided to add to version 1.3 is a random power-ups mode, and this is just pure chaos and I love it. Unsurprisingly, this was inspired by Mario Kart items, in which an item roulette is rolled and that gives you a specific item where it lands on. The way I achieved this was also, as you would expect, remarkably simple. When the level is generated, the game checks if the random item mode is enabled. If it is, then all items are replaced with another object. The object sprite, which is the image that you see on the screen, goes through every single power-up sprite, which is stored in an array, and whenever a player collides with said object, it destroys itself and immediately creates the power-up of which sprite it was on. That may sound complicated in explaining, but in practice it's amazingly simple, albeit very tacked onto the end. Nevertheless, it works, and being inefficient shouldn't matter too much since the game is so simple at its core. Now for the smaller, usually more simple changes. To begin with, when restarting the game, either through the pause menu or at the end of the game, the splash screen and title animation will no longer play. This is just for convenience sake, yet a lot of code did actually have to be added to fix any bugs. Too specific to explain generally, but it did cause a couple of headaches over the past few days. Game scaling is something that I've always had trouble with, and this is no exception. Initially I noticed black bars appearing on the game, and when I printed the resolution, it's supposed to be being 1920 by 1080 or 1080p, it was instead 1920 by 1061. This was confusing to say the least. After about half an hour of checking if somewhere in my code it was squishing the game down by 19 pixels, I consulted the GameMaker Discord. While doing this, I also created a scrap project to showcase my problem. Weirdly enough, the person that replied to my message on Discord could not get the same results as me. Whatever I did, setting the game resolution to that of my monitors would not work. Even if I changed the game's initial starting resolution to 1080p, it would be even weirder and come out at 1864 by 1049. Just what? Eventually, I had a look on Reddit and found a post pretty much describing my exact problem, almost word for word. But unfortunately, that was never solved, and neither would mine to a certain extent. So you may be wondering, how have I managed to get around this problem and actually release the damn game? Well, I worked out that forcing the game to run in borderless mode made resolutions consistent to what I set them 100% of the time. So yeah, it works, but I'd still prefer to have a borderless option. On the bright side, I prefer how the borderless mode functions, so it's not that big of a deal. That, though, was a horrible, glitchy, buggy mess to say the least when I was working on it. But I decided to continue tinkering with the display options because there's a couple of things that I didn't quite like, or weren't quite working. This is always something necessary but painfully annoying to do in games, Game Maker games specifically, and as there's no native pixel perfect scaling, it gets quite annoying. Personally, I use pixelated post-pixel perfect scaling, say that over and over again, yet it wasn't working properly for 1366 by 768 resolutions, or the most common older laptop resolution. Most newer laptops do in fact run in 1080p, but I want Maze Madness to work on everything, especially since it's so simple. Eventually, I fixed scaling for all the resolutions, but 1366 by 768, which the scaling was actually broken for the longest time-ish. It's hard to explain. Either way, changing resolution works better now, even if that specific resolution isn't quite right. At least you can use 720p as a placeholder for now. And that brings us to the end of this developer's commentary. Wow. When I had an idea to make one, I didn't expect 1,000 words. Oh well, it's detailed and informative, I guess. There's a couple of things that I need to add or fix, such as options for GUI scaling, as well as random power-ups and single player being slightly off. Either way, that would probably come in version 1.3.1. I'm planning on getting a Linux port working in the next couple of days, so if you're on a Linux system or want to try running Maze Madness on a Linux system, that should be coming out in a little bit. That about wraps it up. The download link is in the description, and thanks for watching, as always.